I've started a new channel called Lunila Tales. Please subscribe and watch my best stories there. Link is in the description. The mug of ale hit the wall so hard that the foam slid down like melting snow, right next to the mayor's portrait. Then came the sound of laughter, boisterous, drunken, and noble. The kind that made peasants lower their eyes and bartenders start praying for an early closing. And just when the tavern owner thought it couldn't get worse, Lord Fenric tried to dance on the table. He was round, red-faced, and balanced like a barrel on a stick, wobbling with every hiccup. The entire crooked crown groaned under his weight. Somewhere in the corner, a hooded man quietly set his mug down and muttered, "Here we go again." It began as an ordinary night in the town of Greystone, where bad ale met worse company. The Crooked Crown had seen its share of tavern scuffles, but nothing quite like when the nobles came slumming for a taste of the people. Tonight, 3 of them had arrived uninvited, dressed in velvet that cost more than the inn itself. Lord Fenric, Lady Selda, and Lord Orwyn, collectively known as the Court Clowns to anyone brave enough to whisper it. They ordered the strongest ale, insulted every bard, and decided the locals should entertain them for free. Fenric raised his tankard and slurred, "To the peasants, may their coin never touch velvet." The laughter that followed was the sound of arrogance given voice. May, the tavern keeper, had seen fools before, but this was artistry. She wiped the counter and whispered to her cook, "Keep the knives close. Rich drunkards always bleed the same." The bard on stage tried to lighten the mood with a cheerful tune about lost love and cheap beer. Unfortunately, his timing was poor. When he spun around, his mug caught Fenric's cloak, sending half a pint of ale straight onto the noble's embroidered chest. The tavern froze. Fenric looked down at the spreading stain like it was a personal betrayal from the gods. Then came the roar. "You dare baptize me in swine's drink?" Chairs screeched back. Tankards hit the floor. Lord Orwyn tried to stand gallantly but tripped on his own sword belt, knocking Lady Selda's wig askew. The scene was so absurd that half the crowd laughed despite the danger. The bard stammered apologies, but Fenric's pride was already wounded. He grabbed a loaf of bread and swung it like a club. The peasants ducked. A mug followed. Then another. Within seconds, the Crooked Crown became a storm of broken glass and shouted insults. Someone yelled, "The lords are fighting the furniture!" And indeed, it was unclear who was winning. In the corner, the hooded man hadn't moved. He sat with one hand on his drink, the other resting near the hilt of something old and sheathed. His table remained untouched, though chaos raged inches away. A serving boy stumbled near him, clutching a bleeding arm, and the man's voice cut through the noise. "Go to the cellar." The tone was calm, but it carried weight, the kind that made people obey before thinking. The boy nodded and ran. A chair flew past, striking the man's table. He looked down, sighed once, then stood up. It was like watching a shadow rise. He wasn't large, but there was a precision in the way he moved, as if every gesture was calculated. His hood stayed low, concealing his face, but the air shifted around him. Even the laughter died when he stepped forward. Fenric, still holding his bread club, blinked and said, "And who might you be, beggar?" The hooded man didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and caught the dagger Lady Selda had just thrown at him, by the blade. The sound of steel on flesh never came. He turned the weapon in his hand and set it on a nearby table. The silence that followed was heavy enough to drown in. "Sit down," he said quietly, "or bleed standing." It was not shouted. It was spoken like a promise carved in stone. The room, moments ago a carnival of noise, became still. Even the fire seemed to dim. The lords exchanged nervous glances, trying to laugh it off. Fenric puffed up his chest. "Do you know who we are?" he demanded. "Yes," the hooded man said, finally raising his head just enough for the light to catch his eyes, cold, gray, and sharp as winter. "You're the reason this kingdom rots." That was all it took. The guards who'd been pretending to enjoy the chaos stepped forward, uncertain whether to draw their swords. The peasants held their breath. Fenric hesitated, torn between pride and fear. Then Lady Selda, ever dramatic, tried to recover her dignity by slapping the hooded man. She never made contact. His hand caught her wrist midair with quiet precision. He didn't hurt her, just held her there until her courage evaporated. May finally found her voice. Enough. This is my tavern, she shouted. And unless one of you is planning to pay for the damages, get out. The hooded man released Selda's hand and stepped back. The lords, too proud to apologize and too scared to stay, gathered what was left of their pride and staggered toward the door. Fenric muttered something about reporting this to the queen. The peasants whispered prayers of relief as the nobles disappeared into the night. When the last echo of their boots faded, May approached the stranger cautiously. "You just saved my tavern," she said. "And possibly the whole town's dignity." He shook his head. "No," he replied, "I only delayed their stupidity." She tried to smile. "Name's May. Least I can do is offer you a drink." The hooded man considered, then nodded once. "Water." That caught her off guard. Water? After all that? He glanced at the wreckage around them, at the shattered mugs and overturned tables. "I've seen enough men drown in stronger things." May poured him a glass herself, studying him. His gloves were worn, his cloak frayed at the edges. Yet the insignia stitched faintly into the fabric, a raven with spread wings, was unmistakably royal. She'd seen it once, years ago, on the banners of the Queen's Shadow Guard, a force rumored to have vanished after their captain betrayed the crown. Her voice trembled. "You're one of them." He met her gaze but said nothing. Then he lifted the hood just enough for her to see the scar along his jaw, a mark every child in the kingdom knew from stories whispered at night. The traitor who vanished after the king's death. The door swung open suddenly. Sheriff Braun and 2 soldiers marched in, faces grim. "We heard there was a disturbance," Braun said. "And word is, someone matching a certain description was seen here." May's heart raced. She glanced toward the corner, but the hooded man was gone. Only the glass of water remained, still rippling slightly. Braun frowned. "Who broke the peace?" May wiped her hands on her apron, forcing a smile. "The same ones who break everything else, Sheriff. The lords." Outside, in the rain, the hooded man walked alone down the narrow street. His steps were silent, his cloak heavy. Somewhere above the city, a raven cried. He looked up briefly, as if acknowledging an old friend, then disappeared into the mist. By morning, every tavern in Greystone would be whispering about the night the lords started a bar fight, and the hooded man who stood up. The morning after the brawl, the Crooked Crown looked like a battlefield where the ale had won. Broken stools leaned like wounded soldiers, and the floor was sticky with the remains of victory. May and her cook were still sweeping when the gossip began to ripple through the town. Every traveler, baker, and fishmonger claimed to have been there when the hooded man stood up. Some said he stopped a riot with a word, others swore he caught an arrow in midair. By noon, the story had grown taller than Lord Fenric's ego. The only part no one agreed on was who the man was. Some called him a ghost. Others said he was the Queen's secret executioner. But May knew better. She had seen the way he moved, the control in his silence. He was a man trained to vanish. Outside, rain swept the cobblestone streets, washing away the last traces of blood and pride. The nobles, bruised and humiliated, had ridden out before dawn, vowing vengeance. Lord Fenric's parting words had been a promise to have the hooded man's head displayed on the city gates by week's end. Few believed him, but the thought was enough to make the air in Greystone heavy. People began locking their doors earlier than usual. The Crooked Crown, once loud and full, grew quieter with every hour. By midday, the town's peacekeeper arrived. Sheriff Braun was a mountain of a man whose temper was as famous as his appetite. He stormed into the tavern, his boots leaving wet print. May didn't look up from the counter. "You're late," she said. "The lords were here last night. You just missed them setting democracy on fire." Braun frowned. "Funny," he said. "I heard you had a visitor too. A tall fellow in a hood who caught a dagger like it was a feather. May kept wiping. You hear too much, Sheriff. Maybe you should charge your ears rent." His eyes narrowed. "You know I can't ignore an order from the court. They want him found." She finally met his gaze. "Then maybe you should look in the mirror. That's where most of the real criminals hide." Bronn left with a scowl, but his men lingered. They found the mark burned into one of the tables, a faint sigil of a raven clutching a sword. None of them recognized it, but Bronn did. He didn't say a word. He just rubbed the mark with his glove and muttered, "Not him. Not again." Meanwhile, beyond the edge of town, the hooded man moved silently through the misty woods. The path was narrow, lined with thorns and memories. He stopped by an old stone bridge where a figure waited, an old monk in gray robes, blindfolded, leaning on a wooden staff. When the hooded man approached, the monk smiled faintly. "I felt the storm," he said. "Ale, arrogance, and anger, all brewed in one cup. You haven't changed." The hooded man removed his gloves, revealing scarred hands. "Neither have you," he replied. "Still seeing more than you should." The monk chuckled. "And you still hiding from what you are." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of rain whispering between them. Then the monk spoke softly. "You shouldn't have interfered. The lords will come for you again. You left your mark." The hooded man's jaw tightened. "I didn't come here to start a war." "No," the monk said, "but you were born for one." He reached into his robe and handed over a small parchment. "Word from the capital. The Queen's court has issued a decree. Anyone bearing the raven's mark is to be executed on sight." The hooded man unfolded it. The seal was fresh, the ink still wet. "So it begins," he murmured. "They still fear ghosts." The monk's voice grew more somber. "Cale, listen to me," but the man was already walking away. The name hung in the air like smoke. Cale Arden, the traitor of the Shadow Guard. The man who once protected the crown and now lived hunted by it. He moved through the forest until the trees opened onto the ruins of an old watchtower. Inside, he found a small fire still burning, the kindling arranged with military precision. Someone had been here recently. A soft humming drifted through the air, a woman's voice. Cale stepped quietly closer. A figure sat by the fire, sharpening a blade. Her hair was dark as ink, her smile sharper than steel. She looked up without fear. "You walk loud for a dead man." Cale froze. "Who sent you?" She shrugged. "Depends who's paying." Her eyes flicked to his insignia. "That mark on your cloak is worth 100 gold pieces in the right circle. Maybe 2 if I deliver you breathing." Cale didn't move. "You won't." "And why not?" she teased. "Because you're better than that," he said calmly. "And you haven't told me your name yet." The woman laughed, genuine amusement flickering in her eyes. "Tessa. Spy, informant, occasional bard. And you're Cale, the infamous shadow who used to guard the Queen." She tossed him an apple. "Eat before I change my mind and collect the bounty." He caught it, sat opposite her, and said nothing for a while. Finally, she broke the silence. "They say you killed the king." "They say many things," he replied. "Only some of them are true." "So which part is?" she asked. "The part where I was betrayed," he said simply. For a while, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Tessa leaned forward. "If the lords framed you once, what makes you think they won't do it again?" Cale's eyes darkened. "Because this time, I'm not wearing their colors." Back in Greystone, Sheriff Bronn sat in his quarters, staring at the parchment he'd taken from the tavern. It bore the same Ravensword insignia, but this one had been pressed into wax, official and deadly. The Queen's seal confirmed it. Cale Arden, traitor to the crown, was alive. Bronn sighed heavily. He remembered the man as a soldier, a legend who once saved half the royal guard in the siege of Myronhold. To think that same man was now a fugitive unsettled him. "The court's lost its mind," he muttered. Night fell over the forest. Cale and Tessa had made camp by the river. She watched him tend to his sword with a kind of quiet reverence. "You still carry it," she said. "The blade of the Shadow Guard." "It's a reminder," he replied, "of what I swore to protect and what I failed to." She tilted her head. "You really think the Queen betrayed you?" Cale looked into the fire. "I think the Queen died the night the throne changed hands. The woman wearing her crown now is just a shadow." Tessa didn't press. But later, when Cale had fallen asleep, she slipped away into the trees and pulled out a small mirror etched with runes. A voice whispered from it, a voice smooth and commanding. "Report." Tessa hesitated. "I found him. He's alive." "Good," the voice said. "Keep him close. When the time comes, lead him to the palace. The lords have plans for him." She closed the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with guilt in her eyes. At dawn, the first bells of Greystone rang out, calling people to market. May stood outside the Crooked Crown, watching the road that led north. A crow landed on the signpost above her door, pecking at the wood. She frowned. "Bad omen," she muttered. Then she noticed something scratched into the doorframe, 2 letters burned deep into the wood. RNG. The Raven Guard. Her blood ran cold. It meant the old captain was not alone. Far from town, Cale watched the sunrise cut through the fog, his hood pulled low. He could feel the storm gathering again. The Queen's men would come. The lords would spread their lies. But he had no intention of hiding this time. The past had found him, and so had purpose. As he walked toward the distant hills, a raven took flight overhead, circling once before disappearing into the dawn. The hunt had begun. The palace was a hive of polished lies. Courtiers moved like clockwork beneath chandeliers that dripped with gold and deceit. The air smelled of perfume and power, the kind that made servants whisper and soldiers stand straighter. In the great hall, Lord Fenric, Lord Orwyn, and Lady Selda knelt before the Queen Regent, their faces painted with practiced grief. Fenric pressed a handkerchief to his bruised cheek. Orwyn fidgeted with his rings. Selda dabbed her eyes for an audience that wasn't buying it. The Queen sat still, her expression carved from ice. She was not old, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been forced to trust snakes. Fenric's voice trembled with false humility as he spoke. "Your Majesty, the man who attacked us was no common drunk. He bore the mark of treason. The raven and sword. It was him." The Queen's gaze did not waver. "Cale Arden is dead," she said. "His body was never found, Your Grace," Selda interjected smoothly. "And last night, he dared show his face again. In a tavern, no less." Orwyn nodded vigorously. "He humiliated your loyal servants before the entire town. If word spreads, the crown will look weak." The Queen leaned back, her fingers tapping the armrest. "I have endured worse insults than the complaints of drunkards," she said. But her tone faltered at the mention of the insignia. If Cale truly lived, then the past she had buried was clawing its way back. Outside the throne room, a young scribe whispered to another, "They say the hooded man stopped a noble fight with his bare hands." The other replied, "They say he's the Queen's ghost, come to collect what's owed." Gossip moved through the palace faster than orders, and by dusk, half the court believed the Queen's former captain had returned. The other half hoped it was true, if only to watch the lords squirm. Back in Greystone, May kept her tavern closed for the first time in years. She scrubbed every trace of the previous night, but the whispers wouldn't leave. A cloaked figure had been seen near the outskirts again, and soldiers were already combing the woods. When a minstrel came by humming a new tune called the Bar Fight of the Lords, she chased him away with a broom. "We're not turning treason into entertainment," she muttered, but deep down, she knew the story had already escaped. Meanwhile, Cale and Tessa traveled the old trade road under cover of dusk. Tessa walked a few steps behind, her fingers brushing the secret mirror in her pocket. She had not yet reported his movements since their campfire talk. The voice in the glass haunted her dreams, commanding and patient. But as she watched Cale move with quiet precision, Every order she'd been given began to feel wrong. He didn't act like a traitor. He carried guilt, yes, but it wasn't the guilt of betrayal. It was the burden of someone who had once believed in something worth dying for. They stopped near a broken milestone where moss covered the ancient crest of the kingdom. Cale knelt beside it, tracing the worn stone with a gloved hand. "When I swore my oath here," he said softly, "I thought I was pledging to protect the realm. Turns out I was guarding thieves wearing crowns." Tessa sat down beside him. "And yet you still care enough to stop them." He gave a humorless smile. "Someone has to. The lords are planning something. You don't summon every bounty hunter in the province for revenge over spilled ale." She tilted her head. "Then what do you think they want?" Cale looked at her. "A scapegoat. Something big is coming. And when it does, they'll need someone to blame." In the palace, the queen met privately with her spymaster, an aging man named Corin whose face had seen too many secrets. "Is it true?" she asked. "Has Cale Arden returned?" Corin hesitated. "The reports are conflicting. But witnesses describe a man of his height and bearing. And the mark, your majesty. The raven and sword. It was seen again." The queen's composure cracked for just a moment. "If it is him," she whispered, "he'll come for answers." Corin leaned closer. "Then perhaps we should give him a reason to stop running. A trap disguised as an invitation." Night fell over the city. In the lower district, a coded message changed hands in a dice den. It traveled from gambler to courier, from courier to noble, until it reached Lady Selda's desk. The note was short and sharp. "The traitor moves east. He must be contained before the banquet." Selda smiled, a thin, cruel twist. The queen's birthday banquet was in 4 days. She and the other lords had already planned to poison the queen's wine, framing Cale for the crime. His reappearance made their work even easier. They could destroy him and the queen in one motion. Tessa and Cale reached the edge of the city at dawn. They hid in the shadows of the old aqueduct, watching the soldiers patrol. She turned to him and asked, "What's the plan?" He scanned the towers. "I need proof. The corruption runs deeper than gossip. Somewhere inside the palace there are records, transactions, orders, bribes. If I can expose them, the queen will see the truth." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "And if she's part of it?" He paused. "Then she'll fall with them." As they spoke, a figure approached from the fog. It was a boy, no older than 12, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "You're Cale Arden," he said, trembling. "They told me you were a monster, but my father said you saved him once, at Myronhold." Cale crouched down. "Your father's still alive?" The boy nodded. "He said if I ever saw you, to give you this." He handed over the bundle. Inside was a worn piece of armor bearing the insignia of the Shadow Guard. Cale's throat tightened. "He kept it," he murmured. The boy looked around nervously. "You should go, sir. The Lord's men are coming. They're arresting anyone who mentions your name." Before Cale could respond, the sound of hooves thundered down the street. The boy fled. Cale and Tessa ducked into an alley as a troop of soldiers passed, led by none other than Sheriff Braun. His voice carried through the mist. "Search every house. The Queen's orders. Find the raven." Tessa frowned. "The Queen's orders? Not the Lord's." Cale's eyes darkened. "Someone's tightening the noose. Either she's being lied to or she's helping them." Later that night, they found refuge in an abandoned chapel outside the walls. Cale lit a single candle. "You could still turn me in," he said quietly. "Earn your reward." Tessa leaned against a pillar, her expression unreadable. "And miss the chance to see how this ends?" "Not likely." She watched him for a moment, then added softly, "You're not what I expect." The morning of the Queen's birthday dawned clear and cruel. The city of Greystone shimmered under banners and ribbons, a celebration wrapped over rot. Every bell tower sang her praise, every market square overflowed with gifts and gossip. Yet beneath the music, the city trembled. Soldiers patrolled in double numbers, and the nobles' carriages rolled toward the palace like predators to a feast. Inside one of those carriages sat Lady Selda, whispering poison to Lord Fenric. "By sundown," she murmured, "the Queen will be remembered as a tragedy, and Cale Arden as the blade that struck her." Fenric adjusted his cuffs with greasy satisfaction. A shame really. The woman did have style. But power belongs to those who can sip venom without dying. Their laughter was muffled by velvet curtains, swallowed by the sound of marching drums. In a narrow alley near the palace walls, Cale and Tessa watched the carriages pass. Both wore the plain garb of servants, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of hoods and baskets. Cale's voice was calm, though his eyes betrayed the storm inside. "Once we're in, stay close. The servants' passages run beneath the banquet hall. That's where they'll move the wine." Tessa nodded, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. "And if we're caught?" He didn't answer. She smirked faintly. "Right. The silent treatment. You'd make a fine statue, you know." He shot her a look that almost passed for amusement. "You talk too much for a spy." She shrugged. "Only when the world's about to end." They entered the palace through the rear kitchens, blending in with a dozen others rushing to prepare the feast. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and anxiety. Cooks shouted orders, scullions tripped over barrels, and every tray gleamed with nervous perfection. Cale's eyes swept the room. He noticed a barrel of dark red wine being carried toward the grand hall, marked with the royal seal. "That one," he said quietly. Tessa followed his gaze. "You think that's the poison?" "I know it is." He reached for a nearby servant's cloak and motioned for her to distract the guards. She hesitated. "You realize if we're wrong, we'll look like idiots in front of half the nobility." "If we're right," Cale said, "there won't be a nobility left to laugh." As the banquet began, the great hall filled with nobles shimmering in silk and deceit. Music swirled through the air, light and graceful, masking the tension that coiled beneath every smile. The Queen entered last, wearing a crown of silver ivy and eyes that hid exhaustion behind resolve. She raised her cup to the gathered crowd, her voice steady. "To peace in our realm, and to those who guard it." The toast echoed like thunder in Cale's chest. He stood in the shadows, watching her, remembering the night she had once trusted him with her life. Now she was unknowingly drinking from a cup meant to end it. Tessa slipped beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to act now. Once she drinks, it's over." He stepped forward, but before he could move another inch, a hand grabbed his arm. Sheriff Braun stood there, half in shadow, his eyes heavy with conflict. "You shouldn't be here, Cale," he said. "You're a ghost walking into your own funeral." Cale tensed. "You know what's in that wine." Braun's expression hardened. "And you think they'll believe the word of a traitor? Leave now before I have to make good on my duty." Cale looked him in the eye. "You swore the same oath I did. To protect the crown, not its parasites." Braun hesitated, torn between memory and order. Finally, he released his grip. "You've got 5 minutes," he said, turning away. "After that, I never saw you." Cale moved swiftly, intercepting the servant carrying the Queen's cup. With a practiced flick, he switched it with a clean one, letting the tainted wine spill silently into a planter of roses. The petals blackened instantly. Tessa stared. "That's not poison," she whispered. "That's death in a bottle." Cale nodded grimly. "The lords don't take chances." The Queen raised her cup again, and Cale felt the tension ease, until a cry rang out. One of the lords at the far end of the table stood, clutching his throat, gasping for air. His goblet crashed to the floor, spilling crimson across the marble. Panic erupted. Guests screamed. The Queen rose, bewildered. Cale froze. He hadn't touched that cup. Someone else had moved faster. In the chaos, Tessa's eyes darted to the dais. "The Queen," she hissed. "She's been hit too." Cale turned. The Queen staggered, a small dagger protruding from beneath her ribs. Blood darkened her gown. The weapon glittered briefly in the candlelight before clattering to the floor. Cale's heart stopped when he recognized it. It was his own blade, the dagger of the Shadow Guard, the one he had lost the night of the king's death. Gasps filled the hall. All eyes turned toward him, the hooded man frozen in the shadows. "It's him!" Lord Fenric shouted, his face pale with triumph. "The traitor strikes again." Tessa grabbed Cale's arm. "We have to move." Guards surged forward, swords drawn. Cale hesitated only long enough to see the queen collapse into Corin's arms. Then he and Tessa fled through the service corridor, pursued by the clang of armor and shouts of murder. They raced through winding halls, bursting into the gardens where moonlight silvered the fountains. Arrows whistled past them. Cale caught one mid-flight and hurled it back, striking a torch from a guard's hand. Fire caught on the hedges, spreading in bright chaos. They reached the far wall, only to find it surrounded. Tessa looked around, desperate. "There's no way out." Cale drew his sword. "There's always a way." The guards advanced, forming a ring of steel. Sheriff Braun appeared behind them, his face unreadable. "It's over," he said. "Drop the weapon." Cale stood his ground. "Tell me, Braun, do you really think I'd strike down the queen in her own hall?" Braun didn't answer. His gaze flickered to the dagger still lying by the fountain, bearing the raven mark. The evidence was undeniable, and yet in his silence there was doubt. Then came a voice from the terrace, soft but commanding. "Let him speak." The crowd parted. The queen stood there, pale but alive, supported by Corin. The dagger wound had missed her heart by inches. "Lower your blades," she ordered. The guards hesitated, confused. Cale's eyes widened as he saw the faint smile on her lips. "You survived," he said. "Barely," she replied. "And yet I find myself wondering who truly wanted me dead tonight." Before he could answer, a crossbow bolt sliced through the air. Corin jerked forward, the shaft buried in his chest. The queen screamed as he fell. From the balcony above, Lord Orwyn stood holding the weapon, eyes wild. "Finish him," he shouted. "The queen's assassin must die." Chaos broke loose again. Cale lunged, pulling the queen aside as more bolts rained down. Tessa threw a dagger that struck Orwyn's arm, sending him sprawling backward. The guards turned on themselves in confusion. In the smoke and fire, Cale grabbed Tessa's hand and ran for the stables. The forest was alive with echoes of pursuit. The thunder of hooves had faded hours ago, but Cale and Tessa didn't slow until the fires of Greystone were nothing but faint embers in the distance. Dawn crept through the trees, pale and uncertain, painting the mist in silver. They stopped near a river where the current whispered like a secret. Tessa slid off the horse, her breathing ragged. "They'll hunt us until we're ghosts," she said. Cale dismounted silently, scanning the tree-line. "Then let's give them something to chase." He crouched near the water, washing the blood from his hands. His reflection wavered, half man, half shadow. "I failed her again," he murmured. Tessa knelt beside him. "You saved her life. That's not failure." He shook his head. "No. Someone wanted me there. Someone needed me to take the blame. The queen's alive because fate stumbled, not because I succeeded." By midday, they reached an abandoned outpost hidden among the cliffs. The symbol of the old Shadow Guard still marked the gate, faded but visible. Cale brushed away the vines and pushed it open. Inside, a dozen figures stirred, men and women cloaked in gray, faces wary but familiar. One stepped forward, an older soldier with a scar down his cheek. "Captain," he said, disbelief softening his tone. "We thought you were dead." Cale clasped his forearm. "So did the world, Joran. How many are left?" "Enough," Joran replied. "A handful here, others scattered. We kept the code alive." Tessa looked around at the remnants of the once feared order. "The Raven Guard," she said. "The court's nightmares in flesh." Joran grinned grimly. "Nightmares have their uses. And you are." Cale interrupted. "A friend. She saved my life." Tessa rolled her eyes. "You're terrible at introductions." They gathered around a dying hearth, the flickering light casting their faces in half-shadow. Cale laid out what had happened at the banquet, every detail from the poisoned wine to the dagger planted in his name. The silence that followed was thick with outrage. The lords, Joran muttered. They always wanted the crown without the weight of it. Another soldier spat into the fire. If the queen's still breathing, she'll be their next target. Cale nodded. And they'll burn the city to find me. But if we move fast, we can turn their hunt against them. He looked at Tessa. We need proof. Confessions, letters, anything tying them to the plot. Tessa leaned back, smirking. Lucky for you, I'm very good at getting people to talk. Especially drunk nobles with guilty consciences. That night, Tessa slipped into Greystone under the cover of darkness, disguised once more as a minstrel. The city was still recovering from the chaos of the banquet. Rumors twisted through the streets like smoke. Some said the queen had died. Others claimed she'd ascended into sainthood. The truth, as always, was less comforting. Tessa found her way to Lord Fenrick's estate, where the man himself was throwing a private feast to celebrate surviving his own poison. She played her lute near the entrance, singing a ballad of betrayal and blood. The irony was not lost on her. Fenrick, already drunk, motioned her inside. Play something merry, he slurred. Tonight we drink to new beginnings. She smiled sweetly and began to play, her voice soft as honey. As she sang, her other hand worked behind her back, sprinkling a fine dust along the table's edge, a sedative strong enough to fell a horse. Within minutes, Fenrick's laughter slurred into confusion. You have a lovely voice," he mumbled, eyes fluttering. "Who sent you?" Tessa leaned close, her tone playful. "You did, my lord. When you decided to kill your queen." His eyes widened as realization dawned, but before he could shout, he collapsed forward onto his plate. Tessa searched his desk quickly, rifling through ledgers and sealed letters. One caught her eye, a list of payments signed by 3 noble hands, including Fenrick's, marked with the words for special services. She tucked it into her sleeve and vanished into the night. At dawn, she returned to the outpost with the document. Cale read it carefully, his jaw tightening. This proves their coordination, but not the attempt on the queen's life. We need something stronger. Tessa sighed. You could just burn their estates down and call it justice. He looked up, a faint spark of humor in his eyes. Tempting. He turned to Joran. Spread word to our people. We move tonight. Joran nodded. Where? Cale stood, his shadow stretching across the cracked floor. The Crooked Crown. Where it all began. By evening, the tavern was alive again, though the laughter was strained. Soldiers drank in uneasy clusters, their captain missing, their queen recovering, their orders unclear. May wiped the counter and froze when the door creaked open. Cale stepped inside, followed by a dozen cloaked figures. You, she whispered, relief and fear tangled in her voice. You brought trouble back with you. He smiled faintly. It never really left. The Raven Guard spread out silently, taking positions. Tessa perched on a stool near the bar, her lute in hand, pretending to play while her eyes tracked every movement. May leaned close to Cale. They've been here all week. The Lord's spies. Waiting for you. Cale's expression didn't change. Then let's not keep them waiting. The trap was sprung an hour later. Lord Fenrick, escorted by mercenaries, burst into the tavern, his bruised pride puffing out his chest. So the ghost returns, he sneered. How thoughtful of you to come to your own execution. Cale rose slowly. I came to deliver yours. Fenrick laughed, a deep, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. You think your little band of relics can stop me? You're nothing but old shadows. Cale stepped forward, eyes like steel. Then let's see how well you fight the dark. The tavern erupted. Swords clashed, tables splintered, torches fell. The fight was chaos and rhythm combined, steel meeting wood, laughter meeting screams. Tessa swung a lute like a weapon, shattering it over a mercenary's head. Joran slammed another through a window. Cale and Fenrick met in the center, blades flashing. Fenrick fought with fury, but Cale fought with purpose. Every strike was precise, controlled, inevitable. Fenric lunged with a roar, but Cale sidestepped, twisted his wrist, and drove his blade into the noble's chest. For a moment, Fenric's eyes met his, full of disbelief. "You'll die a traitor," he gasped. Cale withdrew his sword. "Then I'll die telling The fires burned for 2 days. Smoke curled above Greystone like a shroud, drifting across the hills and settling over the palace towers. The city stank of ash and fear, but beneath the ruin there was movement, quiet, deliberate, and unseen. Cale and the remnants of the Raven Guard hid within the catacombs beneath the chapel ruins, planning their next strike. The death of Lord Fenric had sent shockwaves through the court. Some nobles fled, others fortified their estates. The queen, still recovering from her wound, had withdrawn from public sight. Rumor said she was in mourning, others claimed she was preparing to name a new captain of the guard. Cale sat by a flickering lantern, sharpening his blade, the steel whispering with every pass. Tessa leaned against the wall, watching him. "You know," she said, "most people would celebrate after killing a lord. You just look like a man who lost a bet." He didn't look up. "One lord down, a dozen more serpents left. I'll celebrate when the queen knows who her true enemies are." That night, a scout returned from the city carrying grim news. "The queen's council meets at dawn," he reported. "They're voting on martial law. Anyone connected to you will hang." Joran cursed under his breath. "They're tightening their grip." Cale stood, sliding his sword back into its sheath. "Then we loosen it." He turned to Tessa. "Can you get us into the palace again?" She hesitated. "After the last time, they'll have doubled the guard." "You've gotten into worse places," he said quietly. She smirked. "Flattery doesn't make suicide sound better, Cale." "It's not suicide," he replied. "It's the end of the lie." Before dawn, they moved through the underground passages that wound beneath the city. The tunnels had once belonged to the old kings, used for smuggling messages and men during wars long forgotten. Now, they echoed only with the sound of boots and determination. When they emerged in the lower crypts of the palace, Cale signaled the others to stay back. "No killing unless necessary," he ordered. "Tonight isn't about blood. It's about truth." Tessa followed him through the marble corridors, their footsteps muffled by centuries of dust. The palace above them was silent, every hallway lit by the trembling glow of torchlight. In the distance, voices echoed, a meeting already in progress. In the throne room, the queen sat upon her seat, pale but composed. The nobles who remained flanked her like vultures dressed in silk. Lord Orwyn's arm was bound from Tessa's earlier dagger wound, but his smirk remained. "Your Majesty," he was saying, "the people are in rebellion. Fires, looting, murder. All because you let a traitor live. Execute Cale Arden, and the chaos will end." The queen's gaze was sharp. "You speak as though his death will cleanse your sins, Lord Orwyn." The room fell silent. Orwyn forced a laugh. "My sins? I have only served the realm." "You served yourself," came a voice from the shadows. Cale stepped into the light, his cloak falling away, the mark of the raven glinting faintly in the torchlight. Gasps filled the hall. Guards drew their blades, but the queen raised a hand. "Hold," she commanded. "Let him speak." Orwyn's face turned gray. "How did you get in here?" Cale ignored him, walking forward until he stood before the throne. His eyes locked on the queen's. "Your Majesty," he said evenly, "I have proof of who tried to kill you." He held out the parchment Tessa had stolen, bearing the signatures of the conspirators. The queen took it, her fingers trembling as she read. "Fenric," she whispered. "Selda. Orwyn." Her eyes lifted, cold and dangerous. "You planned to murder your sovereign and burn my protector for your crime." Orwyn panicked. "Lies. Forged documents. He's manipulating you." Cale's voice cut through his shouting. "The ink is yours, Orwyn. The seal your own. You paid the poisoner who mixed the wine. You thought chaos would hide your ambition." He drew his sword and threw it at the noble's feet. If you're innocent, pick it up. Orwin stared at the blade, sweat pouring down his neck. He made no move. You see, Cale said softly, even lies know when they're beaten. Suddenly, a door burst open at the far end of the hall. The blind monk from the forest strode in, flanked by soldiers. Your Majesty, he announced, this man is deceiving you. He is not your savior but the reason your kingdom bleeds. Cale turned slowly, disbelief flickering in his eyes. You, he said. The monk smiled faintly. Did you really think I'd let you undo years of work? You were meant to die, Cale. The throne belongs not to mercy but to strength. The queen's expression hardened. You poisoned me, she said. The monk's smile never faltered. You needed a lesson in power. And what better teacher than fear? He raised a small vial of dark liquid. The same poison that failed before will not fail again. Cale moved before the monk could act. Their blades met in a clash of sparks, echoing through the chamber. The monk fought with surprising speed, every strike precise and deliberate. You trained me, Cale said between blows. And you learned too well, the monk replied. Steel rang and Cale's sword found its mark, slicing through the monk's guard. The old man fell to his knees, blood darkening his robes. Even shadows cast light when they fall, he murmured before collapsing. The hall was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the faint hiss of torches. The queen rose slowly, her eyes never leaving Cale. You could have killed me, she said. Instead, you saved me twice. Cale bowed his head. I failed you once. I won't again. She stepped closer. You were exiled for treason, condemned for a crime you did not commit. The throne owes you more than forgiveness. He shook his head. I didn't come for titles or vengeance. I came for truth. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. Then take it. Your name is cleared. The Shadow Guard will be restored under your command. Cale hesitated. Not mine, he said quietly. The realm needs watchers who can still laugh at its madness. He turned to Tessa. She's better suited for the task. Tessa blinked in disbelief. You're giving me command of the Queen's spies? He smiled faintly. Consider it a promotion. The Queen looked between them, then nodded. So be it. From this day forward, the Raven Guard answers to Tessa Vane. The new captain raised an eyebrow. I suppose that means I'll have to stop stealing things. Only from me, Cale replied.